Hi, good day everyone. How's your day? After a busy day, it's the perfect time to unwind, relax, and dive into a great book. Let's enjoy yourself with The History's Greatest Lies by William Weir. The book tells the stories behind history's greatest lies and how, and why, the world's biggest whoppers have survived textbooks and lesson plans for years. For instance, did you know the conquistador Hernan Cortés wasn't as bloodthirsty as they say? Neither were the Goths, who were actually the most progressive of the Germanic tribes. Or, that a petty criminal with a resemblance to John Dillinger was probably assassinated instead of the notorious bank robber? The book contains 7 major chapters. 1. Introduction. 2. The first lie we learned in school. 3. Lies from the ancients. 4. Lies from the Renaissance. 5. Lies from the time of the Revolution. 6. Lies from the American Wild West. 7. Lies from just yesterday. You can plan your time to listen to and enjoy this book at your own pace and time if you're ready. Shall we start? Introduction. History lies. Well, maybe sometimes it exaggerates, or oversimplifies. But you do find some whoppers, such as the second Ramesses' tale of how he single-handedly routed the Hittites at Qadisha battle in which he was actually lucky to escape with his life. And there are some really evil lies, like the so-called protocols of the elders of Zion, an invention of the Tsarist secret police to distract the Russian public from the Tsar's incompetence and provoke them into killing Jews. The protocols have had a remarkably long life. They have been used to justify the Holocaust and are still taught as fact in some Middle Eastern schools today. This book is a sampling of historical lies and myths, the evil and the innocent, those aimed to glorify the teller, and those used to demonize his opponents. Most of us learned these untruths when we were in primary school, so this is a somewhat belated effort to set the record straight by debunking these falsehoods. We reveal the characters involved and their motivations, and detail the legacies spawned by these falsehoods. Scapegoats and their beneficiaries. The reason for the protocols is obvious. The origin of most other lies is more complicated. Take the Pinocchio-nosed gentleman on our cover, Emperor Nero. Nero didn't fiddle while Rome burned because, among other reasons, the fiddle would not be invented for another 1,500 years. But that fiddling tale is probably the most famous of historical lies, which is why it kicks off our survey. Actually, Nero was out of town when the fire started, and when he returned, he did everything possible to stop the disaster, and he even heroically rescued many of its victims. Nero didn't fiddle while Rome burned because, among other reasons, the fiddle would not be invented for another 1,500 years. But that fiddling tale is probably the most famous of historical lies. Aside from that, though, Nero was not a nice guy. He was an egomaniac who believed he was a supremely gifted musician, singer, actor, and chariot racer, among other things. He murdered his brother and his mother and executed his first wife so he could marry another woman. He so completely neglected the affairs of state that historians rate him the worst of all Roman emperors, and for that title, the field is crowded and the competition keen. Because Nero was so bad, the story went around that he had not only done nothing about the fire, but that he had started it. Nero countered that story by declaring that the Christians, a despised minority, had started the fire, thereby anticipating the ploy used by the protocol's authors by many centuries. Actually, attempting to create a scapegoat is a fairly common source of historical lies. Hitler had his Jewish scapegoats. Stalin blamed the kulaks, small independent Russian farmers, for the Soviet Union's economic problems. After Stalin had killed most of them, he needed another scapegoat, so he turned to the military. After a series of show trials in 1937 and 1938, Stalin executed 3 of the army's 5 marshals, 13 of the 15 army commanders, 110 of the 195 division commanders, and 186 of the 406 brigadier generals. That's one reason Hitler's legions were able to get as far into Russia as they did. Somewhat similar to these lies, told to create scapegoats, is the story about how the French revolutionaries took the Bastille, that horrible dungeon filled with the miserable victims of a tyrannical monarchy. Actually, considering the state of most prisons in the 18th century, the Bastille was one of the more pleasant a resort compared to the old Newgate prison of the American Revolution, a dark, dank former copper mine where Tories were confined. And at the time the Bastille was stormed, it contained only 7 prisoners. The opposite of scapegoat stories are those lies aimed to make the undeserving look good, such as the account by Ramesses II of the Battle of Kadesh. The FBI's report of the death of bank robber John Dillinger falls into this category, too. The evidence indicates that instead of public enemy number 1, Agent Melvin Purvis' men killed a pimp named Jimmy Lawrence who resembled Dillinger. The report greatly boosted public confidence in the FBI and ensured that J. Edgar Hoover would keep his job for a couple of generations. Complicated Heroes and Killers. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a poet, not a historian, and he wrote his poem about Paul Revere's midnight ride in 1860 to inspire his fellow citizens to do something about the crisis that was threatening the country, a civil war. The last stanza reads, "For, born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed, and the midnight message of Paul Revere." Paul Revere was a hero, but he wasn't a lone hero. His ride was effective only because of the ancient institution of the militia and the recent network of committees set up by the Sons of Liberty. People want heroes, and sometimes they find them in unlikely places. Jesse James, a robber and a multiple murderer, came to be revered by Confederate sympathizers as a modern Robin Hood simply because he was a former guerrilla and pretended to be continuing the war against the Yankees. Others honored him because he robbed banks and railroads, neither of which were popular with rural people. Did he give to the poor? Sure, if by the poor you mean himself and his gang. James' fame was spread by paperback books and movies. Perhaps the biggest cause of history's lies is oversimplification. Hernan Cortez was brave, chivalrous, ruthless, and faithless, a complicated human being, but not like his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, someone who liked to kill. Cortez killed only when it would give him an advantage. He tried to stop the killing by his Indian allies after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Galileo Galilei's troubles were not so much about theology as the conflict of an abrasive scientist and an overly sensitive pope. And the tall tales about the so-called Philippine insurrection resulted from a rather insular and naive nation being pitched into an exotic and utterly unprecedented situation. This book aims to eliminate some of the biggest misconceptions about historical events, explain how those misconceptions were born, and at the same time tell some fascinating stories. Section I. The first lie we learned in school. The Great Fire of Rome broke out in July 64 AD and raged for 9 days. When it was over, hundreds were dead and 70% of the city was razed. Under Emperor Nero's direction, the city was built anew. Mary Evans' Picture Library. Alamy Chapter 1. Did Emperor Nero fiddle as Rome burned? In the summer of 64 AD, the Emperor Nero left Rome for his palace in the seaside village of Anzio. Summers in Rome were unbearably hot. The city was overpopulated, dirty, and offered scant shade from the unmerciful sun. Located just 35 miles from Rome, Anzio was like another country, quiet, peaceful, and picturesque. The cool breeze from the nearby sea provided welcome relief from the summer heat. On July 19, Nero and his inner circle were enjoying the scenery at Anzio when a messenger arrived on horseback to report that a fire had broken out in Rome. The emperor waved his hand dismissively and returned to his leisure. The news was of little importance. Small fires were constantly erupting in the city, especially during the summer months. Nero trusted that the police forces in the city would isolate the fire and extinguish it before it could spread. In truth, Rome was engulfed in fire. Efforts to extinguish it only served to increase its ferocity. The conflagration began in the Circus Maximus, the beloved stadium where the emperor hosted glorious chariot races and public sports. Much of the circus had been built with low-quality wood. The July heat turned the brittle benches and railings into kindling. The hot winds quickly carried the flames toward the shops and warehouses surrounding the circus. Fed by the highly combustible trinkets, clothing, and other inventory stored inside, the fire grew in intensity and moved over the hills of the Palatine, the revered quarter where Rome's founders Romulus and Remus were said to have been rescued by a she-wolf. Angry at being ejected from the palace, the emperor's mother, Agrippina, plotted to overthrow him. In a preemptive strike, Nero sent assassins to murder her in her summer home. Here, he views their handiwork. Nero with the corpse of his mother Agrippina, Zanchi, Antonio and the Emperor Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned. Reality Nero was indefatigable in his efforts to quell the fire and provide relief aid to the Roman people. Rome was a class-conscious city, but the fire did not discriminate. From the Palatine, the flames made their way toward the fashionable Esquiline district, where it reduced many of the estates of the patrician class to ashes. The chaos was greatest in Suburra, Rome's poorest and most densely populated district. Suburra's squalid, rickety tenement buildings and makeshift shelters provided more fuel for the fire. Everywhere, people were running, screaming, and crying. In the pandemonium, many were trampled to death. Some committed suicide by jumping into the fire. The brave dashed into burning buildings to save their loved ones. People carried their prized possessions on their backs as they fled. Rome was a city of immigrants, and the foreigners struggled to communicate with one another. A cacophony of wailing women, crying babies, squealing animals, and voices shouting in a dozen different languages rang out in the streets. The deafening sound of buildings crashing to the ground only added to the terrible babel. Half a century earlier, Augustus Caesar had decreed that buildings should not exceed 70 feet. Rome had been smaller and more compact during his reign. Since then, there had been a constant influx of foreigners: Greeks, Arabs, Levantines, Africans, and Asians, and Augustus's decree had been long forgotten. As the population swelled to more than 1 million, greedy patrician landowners erected 7- and 8-story buildings to house the newcomers. The buildings were eyesores. They were too tall, poorly constructed, and lacked basic amenities like running water. Their close proximity was stifling, and fire traveled quickly from one structure to another. These ramshackle buildings could not withstand the fire that raged through Rome. Every few minutes, another fell. Offering aid amid the ashes back in Anzio, a second and then a third messenger arrived with terrible news: all of Rome was burning. Realizing the enormity of the situation, Nero gathered a contingent of guards and, along with his prefect Tigellinus and secretary Epaphroditus, set off on horseback for Rome. They traveled throughout the night, stopping only briefly for the men and horses to quench their thirsts. The party rode into what was left of Rome. Nero was astounded by the devastation. The air was thick and black with smoke. It stung the men's eyes and filled their lungs. Hot embers drifted in the wind, landing on the men and spooking the horses. Stung by the embers and disoriented by the smoke, the horses whinnied and stood firm, refusing to enter the city any further. Everywhere there was destruction. Buildings had been reduced to rubble, and the sickening smell of burning flesh wafted through the streets. Thieves plundered the abandoned shops and residences. Nero was heartsick but determined to take control of the situation. He ordered his men to put out the fires. Coughing and rubbing their eyes, the men made their way through the city. Speckled with soot, the emperor's famous bronze hair appeared black. In the thick smoke he was virtually unrecognizable. Nero dashed from street to street, assisting the injured, offering aid, and even entering a burning building to help rescue a family. A man who did not recognize the emperor was so grateful for his help that he offered him a reward of gold coins. Nero declined the reward and revealed his identity to the startled man. Everywhere, people were running, screaming, and crying. In the pandemonium, many were trampled to death. Some committed suicide by jumping into the fire. Day after day, unescorted by his guards, Nero returned to the decimated districts. He joined the searches for the missing, transported the newly homeless out of the city, and provided food and shelter. He opened up his imperial gardens on the other side of city to the refugees. He reassured the people, his people, that he would take care of them, and he promised to rebuild Rome. Nero had long desired to build the city anew, but the Senate, whose members owned and leased the tenements and buildings that crowded Rome, had prevented him from doing so. The wealthy landlords feared the construction would cost them money. The emperor might expect them to finance part of the project. Many were also superstitious about replacing structures that had been built by their ancestors. Now, at last, the emperor had the chance to reshape, unafraid to get his hands dirty. Nero helped fight the fire, search for the missing, transport the homeless, and in one case, rescue a family from a burning building. The fire of Rome, the 18th of July 64 AD, Hubert Rome into a beautiful, cosmopolitan metropolis. He cried for Rome, but he also realized the fire presented him with a golden opportunity. Rome, like a phoenix, would rise again, only better than before. Rumors spread as Rome is rebuilt. Nero and his court took up residence in his pavilion across the Tiber River. It was there that Tigellinus, his closest advisor, suggested that the emperor compose a song to memorialize the sad occasion. The idea of creating a tragic masterpiece appealed to Nero's vanity. Lyre in hand, Nero stood on his terrace and gazed down at the rubble that was Rome. He plucked at the strings of the lyre and improvised a funeral dirge for the city. Nero's heart was heavy, and after a few minutes he set down the lyre and returned inside. He had been on the terrace for a short time, but it was long enough for the people below to hear him sing. Soon, an ugly rumor spread that the emperor had set the fire so that he might have a dramatic backdrop for his singing. The fire lasted for 9 days and razed 70% of the city. 4 of the 14 Roman districts survived intact. Hundreds of people died. Most of the city's beloved monuments had been destroyed, including the House of Passage, erected by Nero's uncle Caligula, the shrine to Romulus, the altar dedicated to Hercules, and the ancient palace of King Numa. The fire had also ravaged the imperial palace. Nero was distraught over the loss of his treasured art collection, paintings, statues, and books from around the world that his agents had purchased or pilfered on his behalf. Members of Nero's inner circle suspected that he, an avowed aesthete and self-proclaimed virtuoso performer, was more upset over the loss of his collection than the devastation of the city. The emperor devoted himself to drawing up plans for a new Rome. Construction on the new city commenced as soon as the rubble and debris were cleared away. Nero, like Augustus before him, imposed height restrictions on the new buildings and undertook safety measures to protect the city against fire. He enlarged the streets and added numerous courtyards, provided water reservoirs, and reimbursed homeowners for the huge cost of the porticos he asked them to install in front of each house. Expedient builders received awards. During the construction, Nero housed the refugees in the Pantheon and other public buildings that had survived the fire. Temporary shelters erected in the emperor's private garden provided additional lodging. Wine, food, and clothing, brought in from nearby towns, were distributed to the refugees. But homeless and restless, the refugees soon became disgruntled and directed their anger at the emperor. They whispered that it was Nero himself who had set the fire. Some people speculated that the theatrical emperor had wanted to sing to the accompaniment of fire. They recounted and embellished the story of Nero standing on the terrace and singing as Rome burned in the distance. Others attributed Nero's alleged arson to his desire to rebuild Rome. It was no secret that the Senate had vetoed his plans for renovating the city. The rumormongers insisted that the emperor had his men burn Rome to the ground so that he could erect his dream city, Neropolis. The rumors spread like the wildfire that had inspired them. AMH is born. The image of Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned has been etched into the popular imagination. In truth, the story is an anachronism, because the violin was not invented until the 16th century. Additionally, Nero's valiant actions during the Great Fire were well documented. Claims that the emperor ignited the conflagration are wholly unsupported. Contemporary historians speculate that the fiddling story was misinterpreted over time, stemming from Roman opinion that Nero, a dedicated performer, fiddled away his time on frivolous pursuits such as acting and singing. Much of what we know about the Great Fire comes from the ancient Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, and their writings exhibit a clear bias against Nero. Tacitus was just 9 years old when the fire broke out. His memories of the incident were likely colored over time. Suetonius was born several years after the fire. Both historians' accounts of the catastrophic event are based almost entirely on second-hand information and reflect public opinion of Nero at that time. Fierce critics of the emperor, the men downplayed his good deeds, accusing him of arson and callously singing while his city burned. Nero's enduring bad reputation can be traced back to this early negative press. There are reliable accounts of Nero singing and plucking at the strings of a lyre while taking a break from fighting the fire. Such accounts continue to eclipse those of the emperor's heroic efforts to quell the flame and comfort the populace. The crimes of the Caesar people who doubted that the emperor was capable of setting the fire were quickly reminded by his critics of his ignoble past. Just a few years earlier, the man who now plied them with wine had engaged in a horrific campaign of deceit and murder. He'd stolen the throne from his stepbrother, Britannicus, who later died under mysterious circumstances. Most Romans, including Nero's own mother, believed that the emperor had poisoned the young man. Nero also banished his first wife, Octavia, levied unfounded charges of adultery against her, and finally sentenced her to death so that he could marry the beautiful Poppaea Sabina. Most egregious of all was the murder of his mother, Agrippina. The daughter of the great Roman hero Germanicus, Agrippina possessed a regal bearing, angular beauty, and ruthless ambition. As members of the imperial family, she and her siblings were raised in the palace. Surrounded by the constant intrigues of the court, Agrippina mastered the art of manipulation. She had many admirers, but her incestuous relationship with her brother Caligula scandalized the court. To mitigate the damage, her uncle, the Emperor Tiberius, married her off to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a wealthy, dishonest man from a distinguished Roman family. The newlyweds loathed each other and spent most of their married life apart. Nero was conceived during a brief and rare reconciliation. After Tiberius' death in 37 AD, Caligula became emperor. His debauchery knew no bounds. He engaged in sexual affairs with men, women, and family members. He decreed that emperors were exempt from incest laws, and then Nero had long desired to renovate Rome. A rumor spread through the devastated city that the emperor himself had set the fire in an attempt to circumvent the Senate, which consistently vetoed his plans to modernize Rome. Nero, holding a golden lute with Rome in flames, from Quo Vadis by Henryk Sienkiewicz, published 1897, Pyle, Howard 19, the man behind the image-born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, AD 37. The boy called Nero harbored a lifelong love for music and theater that bordered on obsession. He was expressive, theatrical, and exuberant, much to his mother Agrippina's chagrin. An emperor was expected to be solemn and reserved, but Nero's bonhomie was irrepressible. Nero was just 16 when he became the Roman emperor. His youth, compassion, and generosity quickly endeared him to the masses. According to an ancient Roman saying, the public is easily placated with panem et circenses bread and circuses. Nero took the adage to heart, spending great sums of money on banquets, concerts, circuses, and sporting events for the public. This overt attention to the proletariat alienated and angered the Senate. Their disapproval mattered little to the young emperor. The public adored him, and he was intoxicated with his great popularity. The first 5 years of his reign represented an unprecedented period of peace and harmony in Rome. Nero's advisors, the Praetorian prefect Afranius Burrus and statesman and philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, encouraged the young ruler to embrace a policy of clemency and forego the brutal treason trials and executions that had previously been the norm at the palace. Nero was content to follow their advice. In reality, he cared little for politics and fancied himself an artist. While Burrus and Seneca tended to the affairs of the state, the emperor read and wrote poetry, studied the Greek tragedies, and took singing lessons. Agrippina's efforts to redirect Nero's attention were in vain. To the horror of the imperial court, Nero took to the stage, entertaining the masses with his singing and by performing in classical Greek plays. Although his behavior scandalized the upper classes, the rest of the public was initially thrilled by Nero's performances. Roman audiences were notoriously demanding and vocal with their praise and their criticism. Fearing the crowd's response, the emperor's counselors secretly filled the audience with paid applauders. Spurred on by the applause and the constant flattery of his subjects, Nero routinely remained on stage for hours, treating the crowd to numerous encores. Eventually, the public tired of the emperor's marathon performances. Nero played to a captive audience literally. While he was on stage, the doors to the theater were kept locked. No one was permitted to leave. Desperate to be excused, one man pretended to die, regaining consciousness only after he was carried outside the theater. Victims and vices Burrus and Seneca had their hands full with the theatrical emperor. For amusement, the emperor and his motley band of friends made late-night raids on the city. With Nero incognito, they made catcalls at the women and started fistfights with the men. One victim fought back, leaving the emperor with a black eye. Later, he committed suicide when he learned his opponent's true identity. Nero's advisors did their best to rein in the young emperor. Hoping to redirect his energies, they even arranged for him to take a mistress, a quiet freedwoman named Act. The peace and harmony that had marked the beginning of Nero's reign began to erode. He ordered the executions of his mother and his wife. In 62 AD, Burrus died of an illness and was replaced by Sophonius Tigellinus, a corrupt, exceedingly cruel Sicilian whose affair with Agrippina a decade earlier had led the Emperor Caligula to banish him from Rome. Nero was particularly susceptible to his new advisor's influence. Tigellinus persuaded the emperor to resurrect the infamous treason trials. Nero had already crossed the Rubicon when he had Agrippina murdered, and now he eagerly ordered dozens of officials to commit suicide. He became drunk on power. Fearing for his own safety, Seneca begged to be permitted to retire, citing his advanced age and alleged health problems. Nero begrudgingly replaced him with the senator Fenius Rufus. Without Burrus and Seneca by his side to advocate clemency and restraint, Nero descended into tyranny. He had countless people sentenced to death on trumped-up charges. He spent exorbitant amounts of money decorating his palace and entertaining his friends. He abandoned his duties as emperor in order to become a stage actor. By 68 AD, Nero was oblivious to the needs of the empire. Informed of an uprising, the delusional emperor believed he could win the hostile troops over with his singing. Promptly married his sister Julia. Caligula's love for Julia did not diminish his lust for Agrippina, who had taken the horse trader Tigellinus as a lover. In a fit of jealousy, Caligula banished them both from Rome. Snatched from his mother's arms, 2-year-old Nero was sent to live with an aunt. A year later the boy's father, Domitius, died. In 49 AD Caligula was assassinated, and his uncle Claudius ascended the throne. He recalled his niece Agrippina to Rome and reunited her with Nero. Agrippina waged a successful campaign to seduce Claudius and discredit his wife, Messalina. Incest, though frowned upon, was pervasive in the royal family. After orchestrating Messalina's murder, Agrippina ingratiated herself into Claudius' affairs, marrying the emperor and convincing him to adopt Nero and name him his successor over his biological son, the dim-witted, epileptic Britannicus. Politically ambitious, Agrippina used her cunning and sexual prowess to gain the throne for her only son. She was ruthless in her quest for power, murdering anyone she perceived as a rival. Her efforts paid off. Nero ascended to the throne when he was just 16 years old. Agrippina saw herself and Nero as co-rulers of the Roman Empire. Coins issued during the beginning of Nero's reign bear the images of the emperor and his mother. Agrippina demanded absolute obedience from her son, and when Nero began to exert his independence, she became enraged. She conspired against him and hatched a plot to have him assassinated. However, once Nero settled into his role as emperor, he began to resent Agrippina's interference in governmental matters. He eschewed her advice. She wanted him to rule with an iron fist and advocated sentencing traitors, criminals, and rivals to death. Nero favored clemency and chose to banish, rather than execute, the most serious offenders. Agrippina demanded absolute obedience from her son, and when Nero began to exert his independence, she became enraged. Her love for him slowly turned into hate. She conspired against him and hatched a plot to have him assassinated. Agrippina openly threatened to have him killed and replace him on the throne with Britannicus. During dinner one evening, Britannicus fell writhing to the floor. He died several hours later. Nero insisted that his stepbrother had suffered a fatal epileptic fit, but Agrippina and others suspected Britannicus had been poisoned. Not long afterward, Nero sent assassins to Agrippina's summer home in a preemptive strike. Long accustomed to the bloodlust of the imperial family, Rome was nevertheless shocked by the news of Agrippina's murder. Publicly, people acknowledged that Agrippina had been a negative influence on the city. Privately, they whispered that the emperor was a lowly parricide, an abomination. They agreed that a man who murdered his own mother was capable of anything. Christian scapegoats, it was inevitable that the rumors blaming him for the fire would reach the emperor. Nero had an almost pathological need for popularity, and the rumors deeply upset him. He wondered whether the fire had been an accident or an act of arson. And if the fire had been set deliberately, who were the culprits? It was Tigellinus who suggested that the Christians, a strange sect that believed in one God and preached equality for all men, were responsible. In Rome, many people complained that the sect had refused to help put out the fire. Led by Paul of Tarsus, the Christians counted mostly slaves, foreigners, and lower-class freedmen as their members. The sect was highly critical of the emperor and of Rome, which it viewed as a second Babylon. Members of the sect routinely disseminated anti-Roman texts and propaganda throughout the city. The Romans, like the Greeks, were pagans, believing in many gods that the Christians, who prayed to a single god, denounced. Tolerance reigned in the multicultural metropolis, with differences in race and creed mattering less than social class. However, the Christians aroused feelings of distrust and hostility in their neighbors. Their monotheism and refusal to worship the emperor caused tensions in the city. Widely despised, they were considered rabble-rousers who aimed to disrupt the Roman way of life. Historian Suetonius later described them as an uncouth, uncomfortable set of killjoys, hating the normal pleasures of life and denying the people's gods. Eager to exonerate himself, Nero ordered an investigation into the fire. The Christians were targeted as likely arson suspects. Dozens of witnesses came forward to report that the sect had not only declined to join the firefighting efforts, but that its members had seemed to welcome the fire. Witnesses said that some Christians, overcome by rapture, had raised their hands toward the sky and openly rejoiced. They believed that the fire heralded the end of days. Their Savior, the Galilean Jesus, had prophesied a judgment day would come, during which all men would be held to account for their sins. As the fire raged, some members of the sect waited anxiously for the skies to open and Jesus to emerge and lead them to heaven. Paul and another Christian leader named Mark had urged their followers to fight the fire and assist the injured. But another arm of the sect, led by a man called Hillel, stubbornly refused to help in any way. During the trial, Hillel said that Jesus had caused the fire and that the end of Rome was near. He cursed the city and its people heathens whom he said deserved to die. His words caused an uproar. Found guilty of arson and declared enemies of Rome, the Christians were promptly sentenced to death. Savage miscalculation. Rome loved spectacles, and so it was decided that the executions would be made public in the most spectacular way. The emperor consulted with local artists and theater directors on how best to dispose of the condemned. A mass execution, assured Nero's advisors, would surely raise the spirits of the Roman people. Held in the Vatican gardens, the festivities reflected a mythological theme. The emperor, dressed as Apollo, rode on a chariot through the streets. A macabre parade of Christian prisoners, some bound and gagged, others sewn inside animal skins, followed in his wake. Lashed to the horns of a bull, One woman was dragged to death like the mythological Dirce. Nero's guards tied the remaining prisoners to stakes, doused them in oil, and planted them throughout the gardens. When night fell, they were set on fire, serving as grotesque human torches. Their burning bodies lit up the dark sky and provided illumination for the festivities. Their screams of agony echoed through the night. Nearly 1,000 Christians were executed, their deaths made into entertainment. It had been an unprecedented gala event, but the emperor had misjudged his people. Many were appalled at his savagery and cruelty. His efforts to ingratiate himself with his public backfired. Nero, however, was too busy to notice. He was preoccupied with building his new palace, a colossal 300-room estate he dubbed the Golden House. He spent extravagant sums of money, depleting the treasury and nearly bankrupting the city. The fall of the emperor, nearly 1,000 Christians were tried and found guilty of starting the Great Fire of Rome. Sentenced to death, their executions were a grotesque public spectacle. Some were set afire, others fed to wild dogs. Nero was never able to regain the public's affection. In 67 AD, Rome was on the verge of famine, largely as a result of the emperor's vast spending. Dissent brewed in the streets as well as the Senate. Significant uprisings against the emperor were breaking out in the provinces. Despite these pressing matters, Nero chose to embark on a year-long tour of Greece, leaving the care of the Roman Empire in the hands of the freedman Helius. Nero made his way through Greece, performing for the crowds in the country's famed amphitheaters and competing in singing competitions and chariot races. The Greeks were flattered by Nero's imperial tour. In competition after competition, the Roman emperor emerged victorious. His achievements owed less to his innate talents and more to his elevated social status. No one dared upstage or best the emperor. To Nero, performing had become everything. Governing the empire was not a priority. The Roman populace felt betrayed and abandoned by their emperor. What's more, the collective sentiment was that he made a mockery of himself and Rome by competing for worthless trinkets in another land. Faced with a food shortage and an absentee ruler, the public grew bitter and angry. Spain, Gaul, and Africa now refused to recognize Nero's authority. Worse still, there were rumors that General Galba, a man who Nero had sentenced to death, was planning a coup against him. Helius implored the emperor to return home, and in 68 AD he finally acquiesced. Nero had neglected his office and his people for too long, and as a result, he had few remaining allies. His reputation was irreparably damaged. The Senate and the Roman Praetorian Guard turned against him, supporting Galba's claim to the throne. Nero was deposed and declared a public enemy. He was the first and last Caesar to receive that ignominious designation. Shunned and humiliated, he committed suicide. Assisted by his secretary, Epaphroditus, he stabbed himself in the throat with a dagger. Nero's last words were, "What an artist dies in me." Lost legacies. Although Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned, it would be an understatement to say that he was derelict in his duties as an emperor after the Great Fire of 64 AD. The last in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero is remembered more for his crimes and shortcomings than his accomplishments. Historians generally consider Nero to be the worst emperor in Roman history. Yet, Nero did accomplish many things during his reign. One of the first urban renewalists, he transformed Rome into a magnificent city. Nero's Rome was sleeker, cleaner, and more functional than it had been before the Great Fire. His extravagant Golden House stands as a grand feat of architecture. Nero designed with an eye for form and function, and under his guidance, Rome blossomed. Nero's legacy lives on in the streets and architecture of modern Rome. End of Chapter 1. The first lie we learned in school. Should you want to continue to Chapter 2, Lies from the Ancients, please proceed to the next video. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this book. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you.